Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll picking up with the Ramban on chapter 22, verse 6. Chapter 22, verse 6. Really near, probably around 80% of the way through the Ramban, maybe even 90% of the way through the Ramban, beginning with V'chein Masha Amru Lefisha Oseh. Just to bring everybody up to speed, we're not going to spend a long time on the Ramban at this point, but just we were discussing the mitzvah of sending away the mother bird is thought of as a mitzvah having to do with mercy, and yet there are all these quotes that say, like, if you think that the mitzvah of saving the mother bird is about God's mercy, you're wrong, you do this, you do that. So it's just very complicated. So the Rambam talks about this. Ramban cites the Rambam, and the Rambam says, look, there's a machlokas in the Gemara as to if we're supposed to be focused on the reasons of the mitzvos, or we're not supposed to be focused on the reasons of the mitzvos. So these quotes that say, don't say this and don't say that, is according to the opinion, says you're not supposed to be focused on the reasons of the mitzvos. What the Ramban has been presenting, and we spent some time on it yesterday, is that in the broad sense of things, what we really mean with these quotes, in other words, he doesn't really present it to, well, it just must be a machlokas. He has a different approach. He says what we really mean is that it's fine to say that certain mitzvos are because God wants us to be more compassionate. But if it's not as much that God is having compassion on this creature or that creature, it's that God is giving us opportunities to build our compassion. That's just a very loose summary. And I think this last paragraph that we'll see, hopefully will crystallize it a little bit. V'chein masha amru, v'sha oseh midosav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu rachamim ve'einam el gzeiros. Another interesting quote. The Gemara says, don't get all bogged down by these explanations, because like the explanation with the sending away the mother bird, if you get bogged down by the explanations with the sending away the mother bird, you're making out Kadosh Baruch Hu to be a God of mercy and not of decrees. Oh, gosh, I thought he was a God of mercy. Is he not a God of mercy? Lomar shlo chosak kel yisparach al kan sipur v'lo higiu rachamav al osovi espino. He says what the Gemara is saying, that mitzvah is not about God having mercy on the mother, or about God having mercy on the parent and child getting shechted. She'ein rachamav magim b'vali nefesh habahamis limnoa sanim ulasos ben tzorachenu. If God was really, really merciful on these creatures, he would tell us we're not allowed to shecht them. We are allowed to shecht them. God is so merciful on the cow. He tells us that we shouldn't shecht the cow and its child on the same day. You know something? You know what would be really merciful? If he told us not to shecht the cow. The cow's about to die. God's not interested in that. Why not? If this is all about God's mercy on the animal, he would have said, don't shecht the animal. God is trying to build within us this character of mercy, and that we shouldn't be people of cruelty. That cruelty has a way of spreading through the soul of a person. It could very well be that a person who's a butcher or a slaughter, someone who does shchita, has to deal with an inclination of being cruel. That I want to be very clear. That doesn't mean that a person who does these mitzvos is cruel, but it's something that a person would have to. It's like a congregational rabbi might have to work on not being too verbose at the Shabbos table. It's one of these types of things, okay. V'hinei ha-mitzvos ha'elu ba-behema uva-of einan rachmim aleihem. These mitzvos about how we are to treat different creatures, it's actually not about God having mercy on these creatures. Avolhem gzeiros banu. It's about God's giving decrees for us, lahadrichenu, to guide us, ulalamed osanu hamidos hatovos, and to teach us these good traits. V'chein yikruhem kol hamitzvah shebatorah al aseh v'lo saseh gzeros k'mo she'amru b'mshal hamelech shenichlas l'medina amru lo avadav gzor aleinu gzeros amru lahem kshetekablu malchus yegzor aleichem gzeros Kach amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, kibaltem aleichem malchusi, kablo aleichem zeirosei lo yelecha. So the idea of calling God's mitzvos decrees is that it's a decree, and who knows what in the world is going on with it, and we have no idea what the significance of it. That's not the point, says the Ramban. The point is that we're doing these things because this is what God said. But we can certainly reflect on them, and we can certainly learn from them. Okay, so it's an interesting discussion. We didn't see it in its entirety, but I hope you got enough of a feel for it. Okay, chapter 23, verse 4. Chapter 23, verse 4. Lo yavo Amoni uMoavi b'kal Hashem. Let not an Ammoni or a Moavi come into the congregation of God. Gam dorasiri lo yavo lahem b'kal Hashem ad olam. And also the 10th generation shouldn't come into the congregation of God forever. Verse 5. Al dvara shelo kidmu eschem b'alechem u'v'mayim. Because of the fact that they didn't greet you with bread and water, baderech b'tzei schem b'mitzrayim, on the path when you left Egypt, v'asher sachar olechas bilam ben bor mipsor ram naraim l'kaleka, and that there were members of Moab who hired Bilam to curse you. So I just want to first explain what we're saying here. This is a very, very interesting statement. What we mean is that if somebody from Ammon or Moab were to convert to Judaism, even though they converted to Judaism, they're not allowed to marry regular members of the Jewish people. They'd certainly be allowed to marry each other, as conversation, but they're not allowed to marry regular members of the Jewish people because of these terrible things that they did or didn't do, that they didn't greet you with bread and water when you left Egypt, and they tried to hire Bilam. Now, I just want to say as an aside that the Gemara, it's a very famous statement from the Gemara, we have no idea who comes from anywhere today. In other words, it's the Bas Sancheirav of Bilbel. The Gemara says that Sancheirav moved everybody around so that nobody should have too much of a sense of identity and connection to their own land. So if someone says they're an Ammoni or Moavi, they don't even know what they're talking about. We don't know what they're talking about. So this halacha at this point is no longer a practical halacha, but it's still an interesting thing to think about. Okay, so there's a lot to think about in this pasuk, just in terms of the details of the pasuk. Let's start with the Ramban on pasuk Hey. Al dvara shelo kidmu eschem b'alechem u'v'mayim, because they didn't greet you with bread and water. So first of all, matzinu ochel ba'kesef tashbireni v'ochalti u'mayim ba'kesef titen li v'shasisi. If you remember, Moshe Rabbeinu reaches out to different nationalities as they're traveling through, and he says to them, I'm happy for you to charge me for food, and for our nation, we'll pay for our food as we pass through your land. We'll pay for our drink as we pass through your land. Kasher asuli b'nei Esav hayoshvim b'seir, v'hamoavim hayoshvim ba'ar. Moshe Rabbeinu says, I'd love to get provisions from you, just like I did with the people of Moab. That's a pasuk earlier in this book. And in the pasuk we just read, the Torah says, Moab didn't take care of you with bread and water. Moshe Rabbeinu says they did. Moshe Rabbeinu himself said they did. So what's going on? So, V'rabim amru sheim lo kidmu osam aval Yisrael kanu mehem. So many people give the answer, Sister Ramban, that if you look at the language of our pasuk, the criticism is they didn't greet you with bread and water. Kidmu means koda means first, to proceed. They didn't preemptively come and offer you. We had to ask them, could we buy it from you? And they consented. So that's the criticism. The Ramban says v'zehevel. I think that's totally wrong. Kidai l'machlish yimkru lahem kasher yirtzu liknos. The Ramban can't believe that the criticism is that we had to ask them to sell it to us as opposed to them offering it to us. That the question is who said what first. The Ramban says I can't believe that. Ki Yisrael lo bo b'gvul Moav v'Moavim hotziu lahem lechem umayim b'kesef. Ramban says it's not even true. They did come to us. V'akasif yisaper she'asu haMoavim kasher asu b'nei Esav v'lo mayarchik haMoavi la'olam bavur zeh v'lo yisayiv ha'edomi. By the way, so first of all, the Ramban says if you look at the Psukim, it's clear that they did come out to us. So even the distinction doesn't seem to make sense. And the second thing is, to whatever extent we've boiled it down, that whatever it is about Moab that was wrong, about how they greeted us, Moshe Rabbeinu puts Moab and the descendants of Esav in the same basket. So if Moab and the descendants of Esav are in the same basket, then why don't the descendants of Esav, why don't the Edomites have the same halacha as the Moabites? And they don't. This is very confusing. Rabbi Avrama Amar Kitam Kasher Asu Libnei Esav VaMoavim Al Brav Artzecha Baderech Avolo Machru Lohem Lechem Umayim. Ibn Ezra says you're looking at the pasuk earlier in Sefer Dvarim wrong. He says it's not that the Moabites offered us provisions. Moshe Rabbeinu was saying, I want to go through your land like the Moabites let me go through their land. It's not, he says, I want to go through your land and I want to buy provisions from you. Like what happened with Moab. The Ibn Ezra says he doesn't mean the Moabites sold provisions. He means the Moabite let him go through. Came Avru Bahar Seir V'ar, Rak Melech Edom Lohinicham Lavor Derech Medinaso. Okay, so that's the Ibn Ezra's pshat, that really Moab didn't offer them provisions, and Moshe's not saying Moab offered them provisions. He's saying, let me go through like I went through Moab. Gam Zehevel, Ramban says, I think that's wrong too. Kiem Shochu El Edom Ebra V'Artzecha, V'ima Ein Edom Nesones Yisrael Avor B'Gvulo, V'in Leino Lo Nichnasu Klal B'Gvul Edom. Ramban says, how could you say that? He's referencing again the descendants of Esav. The descendants of Esav didn't let us go through their land. So this is very, very difficult just to try to get our hands on what's going on here. Skipping about 10 lines. Vanira Elai. Ramban says, I think the pshat is a fascinating pshat from the Ramban. And it's fascinating, both in terms of Parshanut, it's fascinating, but also in terms of just the life statement. We're not saying that there's anything that Ammon and Moab did that was so beyond the pale in a vacuum, and that since they did this or didn't do that, they can't come, they can't marry into our nation. We're not saying that. What we're saying is Ammon and Moab both exist, literally exist, because of the kindness of our ancestor Avraham. Shehitzil aviem v'ima min acherev vashvi. Ammon and Moab are the children / grandchildren of Lot, right? If you remember, Lot and his 2 daughters go and they think the world is over, and his 2 daughters convince him. It's a whole story, but they have relations with them. And one daughter bore a child named Ammon, and one daughter bore a child named Moab. These people, if you remember, before the destruction of Sodom, Avram went to save Lot because there was a war. None of these nations would have existed if not for the kindness of Avram Avinu. So how could it be that they do this to us? How is it possible they would do this to us? They owe us their very existence. And instead they do ill to the Jewish people. Moab, descendants of Lot, hired Bilam to curse the Jewish people. So, by the way, there's another thing the Ramban is doing here. The Ramban is bifurcating. The Ramban is saying the criticism of Moab has nothing to do with the bread and water. Nothing. The criticism of Moab is because they hired Bilam. The criticism of Ammon is because they didn't come and offer you bread and water. And this is the whole thing. God tells the Jewish people, stay away from Ammon. Don't even agitate them. But the whole implication of it is Ammon stays in their corner and we stay in our corner, even though we're passing by their border. And it's not that it's so unacceptable. It's that so unacceptable for a nation that benefited from our ancestors' kindness. And if they have no hakaras hatov like that, we don't want them to marry into the masses of the Jewish people. So we discussed this morning the Ramban regarding the Ramban's perspective on what we do and don't talk about in terms of mercy. And we also discussed this morning the different pshatim, the Ibn Ezra, the Ramban, in terms of what it is about Ammon and Moav.